welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is James Jesso. James is an author and public educator whose work focuses on psychedelics. He's published 2 books on the healing power of psilocybin mushrooms, Decomposing the Shadow and the True Light of Darkness. He's also the host of the popular podcast Adventures Through the Mind. Today, we talk about the power of psilocybin mushrooms to heal depression by addressing the emotional material that often underlies depressive symptoms. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Okay, I'm here with James Jesso. James, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you very much.
So your writing and speaking has this kind of focus on psychological healing and psilocybin, in a lot of it at least. And I see a kind of lot of parallels with my own journey with kind of psychedelic healing. So maybe we can begin, if you don't mind, with the kind of deep backstory of where your kind of healing journey began.
Wow, the deep backstory. I'd say, my immediate impulse when I get asked about the backstory is sort of like almost like my eyes roll back in my head and I'm like, oh, not again. But then I also I'm like, okay, my journey makes sense because it contextualizes what I have to say to the people who are listening and sort of like create some sort of merit or authority for the ideas that I have that then serves the larger arc of the conversation. But then I'm also like, oh yeah, okay, I did this thing. You can hear about it in many other places. So I'm going to kind of give like the abridged version. I think that's using it correctly, which is that I was a casual recreational user of substances, in particular cannabis and occasionally psilocybin mushrooms up until I was about 20-ish. Oh, and I not so occasionally was a recreational user of the drug alcohol. You might have heard of it. It's really widely available here where I live. And yeah, then in my early 20s, I got into a culture and a context that led me to taking quite a lot of different substances in a very sort of like seemingly intentionally reckless journey or a reckless manner. And that sort of started off after my first LSD journey. I think it was at Ozora Festival in 2016, or maybe it was 2017. I think it was 2016. I gave a talk that outlined this whole journey very, very well. But I had an LSD experience while I was depressed and like just feeling really down on myself while I was out in Australia. And I kind of like was just crying into my hands, not crying. I said crying, but I sort of used it in this sort of like ancient callback to misogynistic kind of mentality that, most men, I think, grew up with, which is like crying's for girls, crying is blah. But what I actually meant to say was I was whining. I was whining about my life. And then I got shot out of my body and realized, like, looked down, I was like, wow, I am propagating the suffering of my life by continuously repeating a narrative that isn't even necessarily true. And I could change that narrative at any time and have a totally different life. And I like came back into my body and I was like, actually looked my head up and went, whoa, and then that sort of changed the course of things for me because I was like, I could be anyone I want. I will no longer be Canada James. I'll be Australia James. The context of my use at the time, the context of my community, and a lot of maybe underlying factors that I didn't quite recognize was there. I didn't really have a language or an awareness to see them. I was under 25. I'm not sure my self-awareness circuits were even fully on. But then throughout a course of time, I ended up taking quite a lot of drugs very recklessly until I hit sort of a wall also with LSD that was like, hey, you're addicted to drugs. Or it was more like me in the middle of a profound moment, one of the sort of like peak LSD type experiences that people really like call after. You're just like in it, you're in this pocket of infinity. And I was in this pocket of infinity inside of a vehicle locked so that my other friends at the festival couldn't mess with me. And I'm looking and I'm panning a light across the dash. And as I pan the light across the dash, I could see the dust, but I could also see the dust all the way down to the molecular level. And it was all just incredible fractals. And meanwhile, I'm having this cacophony of thoughts that were just streaming through in a way that made absolutely no sense. I was completely disoriented conceptually or mentally, intellectually, and profoundly in awe with the wonder of what I was seeing. And then at some point, something crystallized and it kind of came up as a bubble. I was like as if something was wrong. And then it just came out of my mouth. I'm addicted to drugs. And then my whole nervous system's like, whoa, holy shit, that's true, and that sort of started a journey of me wanting to figure out how to not have this relationship to these substances, which, abridged. So skipping over a bunch of stuff, I end up back in Canada. I end up trying, mostly unsuccessfully, and still struggling, eventually getting to a place where the drugs were out of my life. That sort of cultural space where it was really easy for me to access it was also out of my life. I was back home in Canada. I was living with my parents back from traveling at like 23. I landed in their basement, right? And I realized I was just suffering a lot. And through listening to Terence McKenna and having done a lot of reading of Terence McKenna and others sort of like who were big names at the time, a lot has grown since this is 2009, 2010. I decided I would start taking psilocybin as a way to heal myself, even though I had only just like the idea that it was possible. I didn't really have some sort of cultural, like, yeah, they can heal you, but nothing of any substantial measure. I had read some Jiddu Krishnamurti and a number of other things that were informing the way I was thinking about it, but I had no basis in psychology or anything. And I just started exploring, and then I would have experiences that felt like they offered me a certain thing. And I did it once a month, every month for 13 months. And after each journey, I took a lot of time to try to understand what had happened to me. How do I apply it? And in that time, I started reading a lot of psychology and Jung and all these things to sort of piece together an understanding. And on the other side of it, I was in a really healthy way. I mean, I was still 24-year-old man ish almost, maybe, so it wasn't exactly like I stepped into my like full adult maturity, but I was on the other side of that depression in a way that was very liberating. There were more events from there that sort of led me into another sort of like trauma zone. There's some connection to ayahuasca there and blah, blah, blah. But coming out of the mushroom work, I developed this relationship with the mushroom and a framework for understanding it, that when I would share it with my friends who were confused about their mushroom experiences, every single one of them said after that, all their experiences started to make a lot more sense, and that it really positively impacted them. And then on another journey, the mushrooms told me I should write a book. I wrote Decomposing the Shadow. The story could keep going on and on and on, but that's sort of like the foundation. So 10 years ago-ish, that's where all of this came from. And now fast forward 10 years and I am the person as described in my bio. Yeah.
So it's really interesting, the shift from recreational use to kind of therapeutic use, or whatever term you favor. And it makes sense, I guess. So you're saying, Terence McKenna as this articulate ethnobotanist, right, who's very much in favor of naturally occurring psychedelics as opposed to things like LSD, which, more semi-synthetic. It makes sense, like, that it was you returned to psychedelics with this new conceptual, new kind of lens of what you thought they were capable of, right? Did it seem strange at the time to kind of re-engage with these substances in a way, if you're trying to heal addiction, it seems kind of like that could be quite a scary path to go down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd say like my addiction, and I try to make this clear when I talk about it, was contextually, I was the most addicted to drugs I ever was, and hopefully ever will be. And it was incredibly destructive in my life. Comparatively, I wasn't, I wasn't living in a gutter. I wasn't homeless and using unsafe heroin and unsafe practices. There's no judgment coming from me. That wasn't my situation. That would be a much more intense sort of expression of addiction. I had been smoking things that I probably shouldn't have been smoking, but I wasn't, I wasn't using meth for days and days on end, for example. No judgment against that, but like compared to those types of addicted situation, mine was much more minimal. but it was very intense for myself in my own life, you know. And there was a lot of reading of Leary and McKenna and Strassman and Huxley, and at the time, like during the sort of deep exploration, because I saw myself still as an explorer. I saw myself like, yeah, I'm a psychedelic warrior essentially, right? And I also take a bunch of other drugs because fuck yeah, let's get it. But they, at the time, it felt like intellectual justifications for reckless behavior. And then later they became the intellectual foundations by which I came to understand psychedelics in a much more, for myself, much more mature way, or from a much more mature place. No judgments against people who want to use drugs recklessly or recreationally. I feel like that should be a person's right to do that, with cause no harm being a central sort of rule. But yeah, so there was a weirdness about the idea of like, I'm going to use drugs to fix my drug problem. But if I went to a doctor, it would be something similar anyways. And so, and in Decomposing the Shadow, I talk about my perception of the difference between antidepressants, SSRIs, and psilocybin, which, fast forward now 10 years, is a fairly accurate description before anyone was talking about it. But so it's like, that feels nicely validating. But yeah, I had the sense that there was something different about the mushrooms. There was something different about them. I thought ayahuasca, but I had no access and I didn't have any money. So, you know, either it was circumstance or it was some sort of like underlying synchronistic structure to the universe, the synchronicity mycelia of my life bore the fruit of the mushroom for me, I guess. But yeah, it was weird, but also it turned out to be, you know, like you would know. I mean, drug use has a lot to do with context, a lot more to do with context than with the drugs itself, you know, and a different context produces widely different results. And I didn't know what kind of context I was building. I just kind of had a sense of what I was asking for.
Right. It might be worth going to the, you alluded to the difference between psilocybin and antidepressants. And I have the impression that, I think from listening to your talks, that we have a similar conception of what depression is. And I find we're in an interesting moment where I think people like yourself who have kind of unearthed the root causes behind depression and kind of addressed it often have a better understanding of what this disorder is than a lot of academics studying it with a kind of a distance in a intellectual framework with a lot of momentum behind it from kind of, you know, pharmaceutical sales and all this other stuff, leads to quite a reductionist kind of way of viewing depression as this kind of, oh, it's a physical, you know, spontaneous imbalance of chemicals in your brain. And so in the academic literature, I see a lot of confusion and people not having kind of deep insight into what it is. But yeah, I feel like in your work, you show a kind of an understanding of the kind of what goes on behind depression a lot of the time, possibly not in every case, but that it can be kind of rooted in complex trauma and just our emotional struggles. It's a kind of richer understanding of suffering, really, right? Instead of seeing it as this kind of spontaneous, strange disorder, it makes sense. It's kind of it's a manifest, yeah, it's a version of suffering. So yeah, perhaps you could say something about your perspective on depression and the difference between antidepressants and psilocybin.
Yeah, there's a lot of avenues there. Okay, so let's see if I can chop some down one by one, see what happens. Antidepressants and psilocybin. So antidepressants, SSRI antidepressants. The way I talked about it in the book, although, yeah, the way I talked about it in Decomposing the Shadow was something like SSRIs sort of blunt the depression. So they remove the symptoms of the depression. I mean, obviously not for everyone, otherwise we wouldn't have such a thing as treatment-resistant depression. And that psilocybin, instead of trying to blunt them, forces you, or we'll say strongly encourages you to process the underlying emotional issues that are giving rise to the depression. And in Decomposing the Shadow, I had a language then that I wouldn't use so much now. I've grown a lot. as a person, and also as an amateur psychedelic scholar, right? And at the time, I said it had a lot to do with emotional repression, emotions that we were holding down, holding back, that we were conditioned to sort of keep in or react to in a certain way. And although that makes sense now, I would think of it maybe slightly differently, which is that the feeling function of our body, our emotional system, um, gets sort of set up in a way where certain feelings are responded to in certain ways that are adaptive at the moment in which it was necessary to deal with them in that way early in life, but then get established and sort of hidden, sewn within our identity, and then they get stuck there. And then as we get older, those same adaptive responses and the perceptions we had at the time become the sort of the models that we have for interacting with similar feelings and similar circumstances later in life in a way that is maladaptive, because the unresolved emotional past and the perceptions that were seated then, what Douglas Tatarn calls accidental conditioned history, becomes a veil that distorts our ability to interact and understand what's actually happening. And so we respond to events as if they were the same then, warranting the same defensive reactions, which that's not necessarily the case. And so it becomes maladaptive. But I'll use a metaphor that I got from Gabor Mate, and I'll expand on it a little bit for myself, which is that if we are born in like Antarctica, for example, it's absolutely necessary for us to wear a parka. It's cold outside, right? And when we get older, if we fly to Mexico, right, or that parka is our defenses, right? If we fly to Mexico, and we don't take that parka off, then it becomes harmful. The parka is a maladaptive response to the climate, to the weather of our lives. But it's hard to take the parka off because you learned very early on that it was too cold outside. That if you take the parka off, you'll be harmed, you'll die. I mean, for a kid, you know, having an experience, or we'll just say nothing too extreme. I mean, like extreme abuse is not a whole other world, but it's a more significant sort of discussion maybe. But from a place of like certain feelings not be allowed to be felt, or certain sort of feelings that are present as a consequence of a distorted attunement between you and your parents, that there's like a primal panic there. The infant, the child, it knows that it needs the parent on a nervous system, on like an instinctive level, and then on a psychological level, being egocentric, whatever's wrong in the dynamic, that means primal panic of like, oh, I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die if I don't get this loving connection. They also perceive it as their own fault. They're not able to be like, oh, mommy's acting this way because she's stressed about work. Mommy's acting this way because I'm a bad boy, right? So I have to be a good boy, something like that. Or daddy's acting this way. It doesn't matter. Point is, you get the concept. And so when we get to Mexico later, we've got this thing that from a primal panic has said we can't take it off, even though we're now dying inside of it. And it gets even more complicated when we've had the parka on for so long that we don't even recognize that we're wearing it, right? And so we just walk around constantly hot and bothered and suffering, having weird interactions with others, that makes us feel hot and bothered and suffering, but we can't see that it's because we're wearing this parka, and another part of us wants us to not see it. So that might be some kind of metaphor that may or may not link up with the flow that kind of got disrupted thanks to the internet gremlins. So yeah, how does this relate to depression? So, I mean, there's a lot of different people, I think, talking about depression as like as a consequence, say, of early life emotional trauma. I recently interviewed a guy who does ketamine assisted somatic psychotherapy, and he had a whole model about sort of how to heal trauma, or sorry, how to heal depression as a consequence of early life traumas, developmental trauma, with ketamine assisted somatic therapy. And I've heard other people talk about it in different ways, like Douglas Ataran talks about it as, we get to a place where we learn to repress certain emotions because they're not safe to feel in ourselves. We don't know how to feel them because they're scary. We're not safe to feel them because we're afraid they'll hurt others or others will hurt us as a consequence, whatever it is. So we hold them in. And if you are repeatedly repressing an emotion over and over and over again, the system eventually automizes or automatizes, whatever. And then eventually it becomes depression. And it's something like if your system is perpetually having to hold down your emotions, and your emotional system, your feeling function is as important a part of yourself as a human being as your thinking. And so if your nervous system is perpetually needing to respond to keep something down, then eventually once it automatizes it, then it just sort of everything starts to go down. So you just become down and down and down and down and down, and then nothing means anything anymore. And there's no emotional capacity for hope. There's no emotional capacity to even like feel like it makes sense to even get out of bed. Of course, you could talk then too about how the chronic stress that would come out of that would produce long-term effects on the brain tissue and your ability even to think yourself out. Well, we can't really think ourselves out of ruts typically, but like there's a lot of things that would say this is what depression is. Depression is a set of symptoms. Those symptoms can come from a number of places, but the problem isn't the depression. The problem isn't the symptoms of the depression. The problem is somewhere deeper. And when you take antidepressants, it can help to mitigate the problem of the symptoms. And in biological psychiatry, the problem is that something's wrong with your brain. And so you change your brain and the symptoms go away and the problem is solved. Where a different approach, something akin to where I'm coming from as a, like I said, amateur psychedelic scholar on the internet, so take it or leave it as you would. I could give links to people with more reputable letters at the end of their name to support my thoughts here, but is that there's something deeper going on, and that something deeper needs to be processed, and not just processed, but processed and given a different meaningness. And from that, you open yourself up to being able to conduct yourself in life differently, to lay new patterns, new adaptive patterns, so that you could show up with less distortion. And that with psilocybin, I suggest that it's because psilocybin dismantles the invisible walls that block us from ourselves. And in doing so, reveal what's already there in a way that we can let it out. We can fully embody it. Something like Stanislav Grof said, the funeral pyre of an emotion is the fullest expression of that emotion. We're able to like really let it out. And it's not just we're letting it out. This is something I gave a talk on this at the Psychedelic Psychotherapy 2014. The power went out, and I don't know if the recording ever went out or what, but I said that this is happening, but it's not just happening on its own. It's also happening while you're being held pharmacologically, you could say, but also subjectively, you're being held by an other that is bringing a quality of awareness to your process that gives it a different meaning. I'm not just suffering again. I'm suffering while being held by the mushroom. And so now what my suffering means is different. It's not the same as it was then. I'm also an adult now. I get to have the experience of letting it go while also almost reconsolidating the meaningness of the events that led to whatever it was that became my depression. And so those emotions can come up, and I can develop a new relationship with those emotions and a new meaninged relationship with the events that caused them. And that's held by the mushroom, or it's held by the sense of isness or the sense of the divine or whatever it is that mushrooms awaken. And that the consequence of that is that you would feel less depressive symptoms. A lot of that gets let go. It's like you're lighter now. Your system is lighter. I mean, there's some stuff there about the neurochemistry and having a greater capacity to sort of a greater capacity for agency during emotionally conflicting information in like the sort of 30-day long tail effect of on the brain after psilocybin. But ultimately there's this greater capacity now because you're no longer sort of bearing the load of those things in the same way you were now. And in Decomposing the Shadow, I described it as your shadow as the unknown or rejected or unwanted or unseen aspects of yourself, which includes shitty behaviors, but it also includes emotions that you'd rather not feel, and trauma and wounds and all the rest. And that, like Jung said, something like, we all have a shadow, and if we don't reveal it, then it'll play itself out in life and we'll call it fate. It's that if we don't do anything about that shadow stuff, it starts to wear down on our lives. And the way that it ends up coming out when it's stuck inside is in a way that also bears a burden onto others in our relationships. And with psilocybin, the shadow can be revealed, it can be processed. I don't know how I feel about this term anymore, but in the book, I called it emotive psychosynthesis. So it was based on psychosynthesis from Asiligo, this like Italian psychologist whose name I can't remember right now, which is that we have all these different sub-personalities that get awakened at different times. And psychosynthesis is a core personality, recognizing and integrating those sub-personalities. So maybe something akin to what IFS is talking about with the multiplicity of the mind. And I added the emotive on there because it's about bringing up those emotional pieces and integrating them through feeling them, which is also processing them. So it's like the shadow places, the emotions that we haven't felt, be they from 5 years old or be they from a stressful week that we just keep convincing ourselves we're fine, they become like undigested food in our stomachs. And eventually they start rotting there. And as a consequence of them rotting there, we tend to become distorted expressions of ourselves. And those distortions end up manipulating the way we conduct ourselves in our relationships, which causes perpetual conflict, which causes more, or like can perpetuate conflict, which causes then more shadow stuff to get all balled up and whatever else, blah, blah, blah. And with psilocybin, the mushroom comes in, it opens up whatever defenses we have for not feeling those things, and we can feel those things like digesting the food through emotive psychosynthesis. We process those feelings. And like I said, in the context of being held, new meaning perception, blah, blah, blah. And that's why the book is called Decomposing the Shadow. Mushrooms are decomposers in the forest. The mushroom comes in and it starts to decompose the shadow. And what happens with decomposition? Well, what happens with decomposition is that stuff that should no longer be the way that it is because it's dead, it's over, if it's stuck there, anyways, it decomposes it and it frees nutrients. Mushrooms decompose things and free nutrients into the soil. And so those nutrients are freed up into the soil of yourself as a tree. We can consider ourselves like a tree. And so the raw nutrients released as a consequence of decomposing the shadow is the levity, the capacity, the agency we can then use to apply into our life to change the patterns that were an expression of the distorted whatevers from our past, so as to not put ourselves back in that situation eventually. If we don't do that, then we're likely to land on the other side of it, more or less where we were when we first started. This is the point of integration. No surprise to any of your listeners that matters. Is there anything else there? Let me say this one other thing about being a tree and the shadow. Robert Augustus Masters, beautiful psychotherapist, spiritual psychotherapist kind of man. I love his work. He wrote a book called Spiritual Bypassing. Highly recommend anyone into psychedelics read Spiritual Bypassing by Robert Augustus Masters. We're all doing it in some degree or another. And even if we think that we're all done, we'll discover later that we're doing it somewhere else. But he talks about the self as a tree with lower emotions being our roots and higher emotions being our branches. And this isn't lower or higher in this sort of judgmental higher is better, lower is worse. It's more like lower because when you're sad or in grief or in hopelessness, generally it feels lower, you know, it feels like it has gravity. Where when you're in joy, elation, what would be like hope or it feels more, a little more levity, more effervescent in a way. And so we want to obviously grow our branches of higher emotions really bright, big, nice, thick foliage, blossom trees. But we can't, or blossom flowers, but we can't do that if our root structures aren't deep enough into the earth to bring those nutrients up. And so the way that we grow our roots, the way that we grow our branches is by feeling those things in a healthy way. And if we're not feeling the dark parts of ourselves, if we're stuck, if they're stuck there, or we're just unable to feel the lower emotions without sort of repressing and clenching against them, then they don't grow. And so our blossoms will never be able to bloom as brightly as they could, even if we're working really hard. The capacity just isn't there. And additionally, when a storm comes, and a storm always comes, the likelihood of our tree getting knocked over if our root structures aren't deep, is good, is high, right? And so with the psilocybin, there's not only just the letting go of the past stuff, there's a quintessential learning in there about the value, for example, the value of sadness, the value of feeling sad when sadness comes, the value of grieving at the arrival of loss, the value of grieving as an extension of recognizing simply by having things will leave, or the value of being heartbroken, the value of allowing yourself to feel hopeless, because all of these things, the feelings themselves aren't bad. They're not to be rejected. They deepen us. If we're only stuck there, of course, that's not going to vibe, but there's something there quintessential about the psilocybin experience, as far as I have come to model it and experience it, is about not only, hey, we need to get these old stuck stuff out of us. It's like, oh, we also have to come to recognize that the embracing, the what is it, Trungpa and the Shambhala tradition said something like, to experience unflinchingly also the difficulty of life, the sadness, for example, is a great example, because it's easy to be like happy, good, sad, bad, yeah, okay. Oh, wow, rant over. You're a very good listener. Yeah.
No, that was wonderful. And there was a lot there, yeah, that really resonates. I mean, especially the title of your book, Decomposing the Shadow. Before I was familiar with that title, I had a very similar experience with psilocybin of getting in touch with a kind of a core issue for me, which was a kind of, as you know, when you're kind of overwhelmed, you can have kind of fight response, flight response, but also a freeze response. And so for me, that was a kind of strategy when I was very young. And so I have a kind of like traumatized breathing kind of response where breathing goes very tight and I kind of, yeah, and then it gets kind of gasping. And so I was very much getting in touch with that on one psilocybin journey, and staying with it for a very long time, and identifying with it until I felt this kind of separation from this part of me that was no longer serving me. As you said, it's not like, why is it still here? It's not relevant anymore. And I saw it as just this kind of dead or like dying creature that didn't need to be here. And I remember feeling like, well, what am I going to do with this thing? And then the idea came to me, oh, I'll compost it. And then that way, when I feel these sensations, if I feel a tightness and a gasping, I don't have to think, oh, that's that, irrelevant, annoying part of me that I wish wasn't there. I can say, oh, okay, that allows me to think, well, what can I do to release it? And then use that energy to kind of reinvest in myself. And that was a really powerful psilocybin experience. And yeah, I think it's a pretty neat parallel with your analogy of decomposing the shadow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it kind of goes into what I was saying before about the psilocybin. The psilocybin is playing a significant role. I mean, we could talk about it pharmacologically or subjectively. I like to put character form to psilocybin. I think it is valuable at the very use from like a Pascal's wager perspective. I think it holds utility to interact with it as if it were a thing without disempowering ourselves by overly projecting our own authority onto it. Um, which is that, when you had that moment, you were feeling the feeling, and psilocybin was holding you in that until the manner in which it was holding you offered you its angle on the thing, which is yours, because you and it are one in this sort of like symbiotic dance in the moment that it's pharmacologically alive in you, possibly onwards afterwards if we want to talk about the spirit of a thing, but that doesn't need to be discussed. And it gave you this angle. It gave you this new meaning perception, or a perspective, this new meaning. Oh, this is just an old thing when it's coming up. Previously it was wrong, bad, no, can't, resist, persists, lock it down. And now it's like, no, when that happens, love, welcome, accept, appreciate, allow. And then it changes over time. Your relationship to that activation in your body changes over time. And then the activation itself might go away, but at the very least, the sort of like the compounding impact of being reactive against the activation starts to go away. And then again, at the very least, you start to process those moments in ways that's smoother, less disruptive to your life.
Yeah, I think that's it makes me think of the insight that you gain as you kind of metabolize and decompose these components that might otherwise be stuck. I feel like before one experiences these kinds of altered states, it's very easy to live a life where you just kind of you don't understand the kind of the deep causal web that made you the way you are. So for me, it might have been, oh, I have asthma. That's it. This is just the way I am. There's no deep explanation. It's just the way I am. Or if you're someone who reacts with anger very quickly, you just say, yeah, it's just how I am. I've always been that way. There's no story to tell there. Or if you have depression, that can very much feel like a lot of people suffering depression feel they have zero idea why they feel depressed, right? It's just they're in this kind of deep, inescapable psychological hole and they don't know why they're there. And then I feel like with the psilocybin, it can really start to break up these things and make them more manageable in the altered state, because as you say, you're being held by this very positive, subjective feeling of kind of love, or feeling like you're kind of coming home, or how you describe it. And then, you can go on this journey of starting to unpick what are the causal influences? Like, how can I understand everything about myself, even going into understanding kind of inherited trauma, right? Intergenerational trauma. And you see yourself as something that has a narrative that stretches out in all directions, rather than as this monolithic thing that just has these blocks where you're just like, oh, I just am that way. There's no story there.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm going to talk about something I haven't really talked about with anyone, and do it with you. I'm writing about it, trying not to talk too much about it. I won't tell you which of this I haven't spoken about before, but I'll just throw it all in as like one big lump. I think that it is absolutely possible for people to exit out of the "this is who I am" fixed mind state model of themselves in ways that aren't psilocybin. There's a lot of places where that has become casual learning. That has become almost like more readily apparent in the commons. Of course, you learn it early in life, you got it for life. You learn fixed mindset earlier in life, it's a lot harder to change. So Dr. Andrew Huberman, he says that, after about 25, your ability to learn stuff gets like way lower. You have to intentionally choose to learn it and effort to learn it. And learning a non-fixed mindset, I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is now, is not easy. It's not an easy thing to learn if you're already in your like upper 30s or beyond. But it is possible. There's a lot of places where that is kept in mind. Psychotherapy being a great example. I had a friend, colleague, Nick's son, who is a comedian, psychedelic comedian guy out of Australia. He says, like, he described it as like the pre-therapeutic and the post-therapeutic mindset, right? And with psilocybin, I believe truly that it wants to, like all mushrooms in a larger ecosystem, it wants to bring about what needs to be done to return wholeness to the system. And there's a lot of discussion there about that metaphor, that where it could fall apart or whatever, like, what about invasive species? What about this? What about that? Okay, fair enough. But like, I think that that's what that is what they want to do. I think, I don't know. I've never had a conversation with a mushroom where it wasn't filtered through my own assumptions. So I don't really know what they want. I'm just kind of like, hypothesizing, but that it won't be that way if you don't have a sense of the thing, right? If you took psychedelics, as an established academic with a sense of the thing and a receptivity to the thing, with an understanding of psychology, it's going to reveal that aspect of itself for you. Mindset, like the experience itself, how it subjectively manifests, what it presents to you, and how it presents that what to you, and then how we respond to the hows and whats that it's presenting, is umpired by the mindset with which we step into, which includes our framework of understanding of what psilocybin is generally, but also our mental representation of what psilocybin is as a distinguished something. And then, of course, how that fits in the larger web of our life. And it's entirely possible to have a framework, conscious or otherwise, and a model and a representation that sees psilocybin as nothing more than a party drug. And negative feelings come, that means you have a bad trip. That's also a model. And so then it's not like this thing that is holding you in love and whatever else. Because of that, it's this thing now, this drug that is now assaulting your mind. And so the what's in the hows now change, and how you respond to it changes. And what you have on the other side could still be generative. Anything a psychedelic experience offers you can be made generative, bad trip or not, afterwards, as by the manner in which we choose to work with it or get supported in working with it. But it doesn't happen by default. I do believe what we want to do is establish a mindset and a context of use and a relationship with psilocybin that unhinders its intelligence. And it's very easy to obfuscate that intelligence with our biases and our assumptions and blah, blah, blah. Even if we're thinking really positively about it, it's really easy to come out the other end and say, I know what the mushroom is. No, you don't. You only know what the mushroom revealed itself to you, as to you, in according to what you had for it going in, even if you experience things you weren't anticipating. It can only work with what you got. I'd like to think that over time, it learns you as you learn it. And then what you've got for it and what it's got for you can grow in complexity and coherence. Throwing you curveballs every now and then, because that's what it is, you get cocky, you get a curveball. But yeah, so it's not definitely like that, right? And I think that's really important, especially in the current landscape right now of trying to like position psilocybin as this like incredible medicine, which it is, which it also is not only, but that's an aside. Is that it's not the way Mark Hayden talked about it on Goop. It's like there's a lot there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the idea of how we approach it, I'm really glad you raised that, because you take someone like Terence McKenna, who you mentioned at the beginning, who would talk about these kind of far out ideas of kind of conversing with the mushroom and these entities and things, and it makes sense that for someone like him with a great linguistic capacity and a rich imagination, that he could generate these symphonies of psychedelic experiences that maybe other people going in with the clinical prompting that they should move towards surrender and having a unitive experience. It makes sense that you can have a wide variety of different experiences, including trips that you call negative because you, as you say, have this narrative that this drug is doing something to you that you don't like. And it makes me think that in this conversation, something that I guess bothers me is, so you and I clearly have found therapeutic value in this approach, but we're also the kind of people who are interested in psychology, read about it, and go in think so that when things happen, we're like, this is that kind of experience, and there's some level of already knowing how you might want to respond to it. So you can kind of, it's a skill, right? Feeling your way through the experience. And if someone were to kind of just dive headfirst into this with no interest in that stuff, I can imagine them having a completely different experience that wasn't therapeutic. So do you have any is there any advice that kind of comes to mind as to like how you navigate these experiences, or for people who are already experimenting with this stuff, any kind of tips?
Yeah, well, I mean, all of Decomposing the Shadow is sort of laying that out for people. And then my follow-up book, The True Light of Darkness, was doing the same thing, but from a storytelling narrative where I sort of walked people through my experiences and how I made sense of it and gathered it. But yeah, I think there's a point here, and eventually I think I'll get back to the question you actually asked rather than responding to a statement in the middle of it, is about how I don't really think that you need to have a lot of psychological understanding or pre-established whatever, or certain level of intellectual engagement or capacity or blah, blah, blah. I don't think that that's necessary at all to have a positively therapeutic experience with psilocybin. All you have to have is enough sort of preparation to establish a context of use that is safe enough to experience what's happening without anxiety, panic, and fear. And if those things arise, that you're in a context where people can help you out, even if it's just your friends. Because the thing is that as much as it's deeply therapeutic to like go in and start like crying at old wounds when you're like 6 years old and, remapping your sense of self and the world as a consequence of recognizing how this one event, blah, 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 led to blah, 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 and then your depression goes away and blah, blah, blah. It's also possible to take the mushrooms and just go out and be out in nature with some friends and just enjoy being moved by the beauty of things, being moved by the joy, by the sadness, by this like this peak moment of grief and gratitude, flowing through you, to feel the connection with others, to feel the connection with other things, just to go out and have a wicked, sick dance. These things are therapeutic too. I said recreational. I have no problem with recreational. I feel like these substances deserve respect. I think that without that respect, the likelihood of things going wrong increases, like unpreparedly wrong, like, oh shit, now I'm in the middle of a thing I had not anticipated because I was using it recklessly. And I speak from personal experience. That's a real thing that happens, but also at the same time, I think it doesn't have to be ill people to get benefit. It doesn't have to be psychotherapeutic to get benefit. And I think this is why it should exist as more than a pharmaceutical medicine, psychiatric medicine treatment. It should, I believe in decriminalization. I also believe in good licensing protocols and legislation to prevent misuses of power in a provider recipient relationship inside of the industry or the institution of psychedelics. But like there's a lot of value in these things that aren't all psychotherapy and all the rest. Now, you did actually have a question, though. Did I answer it? I think I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I didn't actually.
It was about any kind of any kind of advice that came to mind for helping to navigate the trips. But you pointed people towards your book, which is a valid way to address that.
Right. But okay, look, the reality is this is my job. I write books, I make a podcast, I help people do with integration coaching as well, although that's not primary. I don't really try to promote that very much because I'm more focused on reading, writing, building great content. I'm there for people who feel like they need to talk to someone, and for whatever reason, it seems like I might be that person. But my primary income is people buying books and giving me money for appreciating the podcast I put out for free. Something like yourself. You have a Patreon, don't you? Yeah. So yes, people, please, listeners, go buy my book. But also, I won't expect you to do that to get some benefit here. I would say that one thing I would put forth is to be conscientious in how you prepare yourself, and if you are able to lean in to the safety of secure friendships, especially those who are people who are experienced and seem to have a respect for the mushroom. And also familiarize yourself and be prepared that sometimes it doesn't feel good. And the presence of pain does not mean things are going wrong. The presence of pain sometimes is a part of the process that you're here for, and the other side of it is likely something more beautiful than you can fathom. So to set yourself up in a way where you feel safe, and are in a context where danger is reduced, because those things are different. And having someone you're with, people that you're with who are familiar, is good. In a stable environment is good. In a house or in a park, not on a freeway. And is there anything else there? Yeah, I mean, this is, everyone's heard this before, right? Start low and go slow. You can always take more, you can't take less. If you've never taken mushrooms before at all, ever, and it's going to be like this is your first time and you're just doing it and it's not being held by like a professional guide, probably 2 grams or less is a good roll, or a good trip. A roll is another thing. Yeah, you start low and go slow. It makes more sense to feel like, yeah, that could have been stronger, but I liked it as your first journey. Then that was too much and now I'm afraid to go back. I mean, anytime you get to a deep place, the fear of going back is real, because it can be tough. It takes courage to take the dose over and over again. But for your first time, low doses generally, they're pretty approachable with psilocybin if you don't have any pre-established concerns about bipolar or schizophrenia. Then I'm not a doctor, don't take my advice. But those are some words that I spit out, assuming that nobody would take them as advice. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. This has been wonderful. Where would you point people to if they want to buy your books or go, look into your work more?
Everything can be found at my website, jameswjesso.com. And my podcast is called Adventures Through the Mind. And you can find it on basically everywhere, plus YouTube. And it's also at jameswjesso.com. And I'm also on Twitter at jameswjesso.com, which I'm on more often. I'm not really on Facebook these days. It feels toxic in a way that I'm not appreciating. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, I very much appreciated this. Thanks again.
Thank you.